In 1968, one woman floated weightless through a spaceship, and cinema was never the same again. But behind that famous zero-gravity striptease lies a story far stranger than the film itself. Scenes vanished. A director fought his own studio. Censors took scissors to entire sequences. And for decades, the true, original vision of Barbarella was buried, altered, and quietly erased. Tonight, we uncover what really happened behind the stars. Welcome back to the channel where forgotten films get a second life. If you love uncovering the hidden history behind classic cinema, the deleted scenes nobody talks about, the studio battles fought in editing rooms, and the secrets locked away in dusty archives, then you are exactly where you need to be. Make sure you are subscribed, because today's investigation takes us into one of the strangest productions of the 1960s. Barbarella looks, on the surface, like a simple piece of psychedelic science fiction fun. A comic book heroine, a galaxy of danger, Jane Fonda in a variety of increasingly outrageous costumes. Critics have spent 50 years calling it campy, silly, even embarrassing. But something was missing from that story. Behind the glossy space adventure was a production in crisis. A director whose original vision clashed violently with what audiences eventually saw. A studio that demanded cuts. Censorship boards across different countries that quietly removed footage that no one has ever fully accounted for. And a series of alternate versions, some barely documented, that suggest the Barbarella we know is only a fragment of the film that was actually shot. Why does so much footage remain unaccounted for? Why did the director later distance himself from parts of the final cut? And why, even in a 2021 restoration, are historians still uncertain about what the complete, unaltered version of Barbarella actually looked like? That is the mystery we are stepping into today. To understand what went wrong, we have to go back to where it all began, not in Hollywood, but in France. Barbarella originated as a comic strip created by artist Jean-Claude Forest in 1962, published in the French magazine Fifth Magazine. It was bold for its time, blending science fiction adventure with open sexuality, a comic aimed squarely at adults in a medium that most of the world still saw as childish. The character became a symbol of the sexual revolution sweeping through European culture. A liberated woman navigating a strange, erotic universe entirely on her own terms. Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis saw an opportunity. He acquired the film rights and set out to bring Barbarella to the screen as a big-budget, international spectacle, filmed in English, shot at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, and designed to travel across continents. This was no small art film. It was meant to be a glamorous, expensive, era-defining piece of pop entertainment. To direct it, De Laurentiis brought in French filmmaker Roger Vadim, a man already famous, and to some, infamous, for a very particular skill. Vadim had built his reputation directing Brigitte Bardot in And God Created Woman, a film that had scandalized and captivated audiences a decade earlier. He was known as a director obsessed with transforming women into icons of desire on screen. At the time Barbarella was being made, Vadim was married to Jane Fonda, and it was Fonda who was cast in the title role. This is where the first layer of mystery begins. Did not see Barbarella as a straightforward action movie. According to accounts from crew members and later interviews, Vadim wanted the film to feel like a living, breathing piece of surreal erotic art, closer to European avant-garde cinema than to American science fiction adventure. He wanted color, texture, dreamlike production design, and a tone that floated somewhere between satire and fantasy. The now famous opening sequence, Barbarella undressing in zero gravity as the credits roll, was meant to set the tone for something stranger and more artistically daring than what mainstream audiences were used to seeing. But that vision immediately collided with the practical demands of a major international production. Paramount Pictures, which handled distribution in the United States, had very different commercial expectations. They wanted something sellable, something that could be marketed on posters and trailers without triggering a wave of censorship battles across multiple countries. Vadim's artistic ambitions and the studio's commercial instincts were on a collision course from the very beginning. Multiple screenwriters worked on adapting the material, including the American writer Terry Southern, known for his darkly satirical sensibility on films like Dr. Strangelove. Southern's involvement added a layer of biting, absurdist comedy to the script, but reports from the production describe a screenplay that went through constant revisions, sometimes rewritten on set. Scenes altered day by day as Vadim, the producers, and the writers struggled to agree on tone. Was Barbarella meant to be pure satire, pure spectacle, pure eroticism dressed up as science fiction? Nobody on the production seemed to fully agree, and that uncertainty would haunt the final film. Behind the scenes, conditions were also difficult in more mundane human ways. Filming took place under demanding conditions at Cinecittà, with elaborate practical sets built for alien landscapes, futuristic interiors, and space vehicles. Jane Fonda later spoke about the physical and emotional toll of playing a character defined almost entirely by her appearance and sexuality, describing discomfort with certain sequences and costumes that pushed her outside her comfort zone as an actress still early in her career. The blurred line between Vadim's professional direction and his personal relationship with his lead actress added tension that crew members reportedly noticed on set, though details of specific confrontations remain largely undocumented and rely on second-hand accounts collected years later. What we do know is this: the film that eventually reached cinemas was not simply Vadim's untouched vision. It was a negotiated compromise, shaped by international censorship laws, studio commercial pressure, and a chaotic writing process. And that negotiated compromise is where the real mystery of Barbarella begins. So what did audiences actually see, and what did they never see at all? The theatrical cut released in 1968 runs a little under 100 minutes. On the surface, it feels like a complete, if strange, adventure story. But historians and film archivists who have studied surviving production documents believe that additional footage was shot for several sequences that never made it into any released version. One area of long-standing speculation involves the extended cut of certain psychedelic and erotic sequences, particularly scenes involving the character of Duran Duran's Pleasure Machine, and other set pieces that reportedly ran significantly longer in early assemblies of the film. Multiple accounts describe test screenings and early cuts that were trimmed down specifically to avoid confrontations with censorship boards in different countries, each of which had wildly different standards for what could be shown on screen in the late 1960s. This is a detail worth pausing on, because it explains why so many different versions of Barbarella exist internationally. Countries like Italy and the United Kingdom operated under separate and sometimes stricter censorship rules than the United States. Distributors would often prepare slightly different cuts for different territories, trimming shots that lingered too long, removing certain angles of nudity, or softening dialogue that censors considered too explicit. Because film preservation in this era was inconsistent, and because studios rarely kept meticulous records of every regional cut, these versions were sometimes screened, then quietly discarded, their exact contents never fully cataloged. What audiences never saw, in many cases, were the small but meaningful differences between these versions, differences that shifted tone, pacing, and even character intention from one country's screening to another. Beyond regional censorship cuts, there is also long-running speculation, supported by contemporary interviews and studio memos referenced by film historians, that Vadim's original assembly of the film was tonally darker and more overtly satirical than the final theatrical release. Some sources suggest entire transitional sequences designed to satirize Cold War politics and organized religion were trimmed or softened, concerned that audiences and censors would find the satire too pointed rather than playful. If true, this means the version of Barbarella most people have seen for over 50 years is a softened echo of a sharper, stranger film that once existed only in an editing room in Rome. The truth was hidden for decades, in film cans, contact sheets, and studio paperwork scattered across archives in Italy, France, and the United States, most of it never fully assembled into a single definitive account. Let's talk about why these missing pieces actually matter, beyond simple trivia. Removing or softening satirical material does more than just shorten a runtime. It changes what a film is actually saying. A version of Barbarella with sharper satirical edges, aimed at Cold War paranoia and institutional hypocrisy, would have positioned the film as a commentary, wrapped in candy-colored spectacle, much like other countercultural films of the era. Strip that satire down, and what remains leans much harder into spectacle for its own sake, exactly the criticism the film has faced for decades, that it is all style with nothing underneath. This is the psychological core of the mystery. Every trimmed scene, every softened line of dialogue, subtly altered how audiences were meant to read Barbarella as a character. In Vadim's fuller vision, Barbarella's naivety was reportedly meant to work as satire, a commentary on innocence colliding with a corrupt universe. In the trimmed theatrical cut, that naivety often reads instead as simple objectification, the character existing primarily to be looked at rather than to observe and comment on the world around her. Pacing changes too. Several critics and historians have noted that certain sequences in the theatrical cut feel abrupt, as though connective tissue between scenes is missing. Transitions that should build tension or develop relationships between characters instead feel rushed, almost as if viewers are watching a highlight reel rather than a fully realized narrative. This structural unevenness lines up precisely with the reports of last-minute trims made under pressure from Paramount and international censors, suggesting the choppy pacing many viewers notice was not always Vadim's original intention, but the visible scar tissue of compromise. Quotes from those involved, though scattered and sometimes secondhand, paint a picture of frustration simmering beneath the film's playful surface. Jane Fonda has spoken in later interviews and memoirs about her complicated feelings toward Barbarella, describing the experience as one shaped heavily by Vadim's direction and by a production culture that often prioritized how she looked over what her character actually did. She has reflected on wearing costumes designed more for visual spectacle than practicality, and on scenes that she found uncomfortable to film, framing the entire production as a formative, sometimes difficult chapter early in her acting career. Roger Vadim, in interviews conducted after the film's release, described Barbarella as an attempt to bring the free-spirited sexuality of the comic strip to a mainstream audience, while acknowledging the difficulty of translating that vision through the machinery of a major international studio production. Even decades later, Vadim's comments suggest a director who never felt the finished film fully matched what he had originally imagined shooting in Rome. Critics at the time were sharply divided. Many dismissed the film outright as shallow spectacle, an excuse to put Jane Fonda in revealing costumes with a thin plot stitched loosely around the set pieces. Others recognized something more interesting struggling beneath the surface, a satirical, subversive energy that occasionally broke through despite the compromises made during editing. Film historians studying the production decades later have generally agreed on one point. Barbarella, as released, is an incomplete artifact of a much larger, messier creative process, one whose true shape may never be fully reconstructed because so much of the surrounding paperwork, correspondence, and outtake footage has either been lost or remains buried in private archives. Now let's talk about restoration and why even modern efforts to preserve Barbarella have run into their own mysteries. For decades, home video releases of Barbarella were notoriously inconsistent in quality, often sourced from aging and damaged prints. with color timing that varied wildly between releases. This is significant because Barbarella's visual identity, its saturated candy-colored production design, was central to Vadim's artistic vision. Poor quality transfers effectively distorted the film's intended look for generations of viewers who only ever experienced it through faded, muted home video copies. In 2021, the Criterion Collection undertook a major restoration of Barbarella, working from original film elements to create a new high-definition transfer that aimed to restore the film's original color palette and visual texture as closely as possible to its 1968 theatrical presentation. This restoration was widely praised for finally allowing audiences to see the film's psychedelic production design the way it was meant to be seen: vivid, saturated, and strange. But even this celebrated restoration comes with an asterisk. It restores and preserves the theatrical cut, the version that reached cinemas in 1968, not the longer, rumored assembly that Vadim reportedly first put together before studio and censorship pressures reshaped it. No verified complete print of an extended Vadim cut has ever surfaced publicly. Whether such a version still exists, quietly stored in a vault somewhere in Rome or Paris, or whether it was destroyed decades ago during a routine studio archive purge, as happened to countless films from this era, remains unknown. This is the heart of what makes Barbarella's story so compelling to film historians. It is not simply about nudity trimmed for censors or minor edits made for pacing. It is about the very real possibility that an entirely different tonal experience of this film once existed, briefly, in an editing room in the late 1960s, before disappearing into studio history, leaving behind only fragments, interviews, and speculation. So, what does all of this tell us about Barbarella, 58 years after its release? It tells us that the film we think we know is only one version of a story that was always in flux, shaped as much by censors and studio executives as by its director's imagination. It tells us that the campy, spectacle-driven reputation Barbarella has carried for decades may be, at least in part, the product of compromises made under pressure rather than a pure reflection of what its creators originally intended. And it tells us that even in an age of digital restoration and archival preservation, some films remain permanently incomplete, their true original forms scattered across lost negatives, discarded trims, and the fading memories of people who were there. Perhaps somewhere, in a climate-controlled vault, reels of unused Barbarella footage still exist, unlabeled, unseen, waiting for someone to rediscover what audiences in 1968 never got to watch. Or perhaps that footage is already gone forever, destroyed decades ago, its existence surviving now only as rumor and secondhand recollection pass between historians. We may never know for certain how much of Roger Vadim's original vision for Barbarella survived the journey from Cinecittà Studios to cinema screens around the world. What we do know is that the film that reached audiences was shaped by forces far beyond one director's imagination, by international censorship boards, by a nervous studio, by the shifting cultural expectations of 1968. So the next time you watch Barbarella drift weightlessly across the screen in that famous opening sequence, ask yourself what you are not seeing. Ask what conversations happened in editing rooms in Rome, what scenes were quietly trimmed and never restored, and what version of this strange, colorful film might still be out there, waiting. If you have any theories, any details about lost cuts, alternate prints, or forgotten footage from Barbarella, leave them in the comments below. Sometimes the biggest discoveries in film history start with a single comment from someone who noticed something the rest of us missed. And if you enjoyed uncovering this mystery with us, subscribe for more hidden stories from the darkest corners of classic Hollywood, the deleted scenes, the buried conflicts, and the secrets that studios never wanted anyone to find.